Pomper is Fish, and he leads our programming.
Welcome, everybody. As Patrick said, my name is Joe Pomper, and I'm the Director of Programming at Beit Mishpacha, Washington, D.C.'s LGBTQ synagogue. We are very, very excited to be presenting this panel on the Conversos, the Jews of Spain and Portugal who were forced to convert to Catholicism in the 15th century, and their descendants, and how those decisions from 500 years ago manifest themselves up through today. This is, as I said, an exciting program that we've been working on for a long, long time. In the coming year, in 2025, Beit Mishpacha will be celebrating its 50th anniversary. We were founded in 1975, and we are very, very excited. And this program is a precursor to what we expect to be an exciting lineup of wonderful programs throughout our 50th anniversary year. So this is a sneak preview of what you'll be seeing throughout 2025. If anybody is interested in getting onto our mailing list, please come see me after the program. Without any further ado, I'd like to turn the program over to Patrick, who will introduce our panelists.
So just a little bit more about Bet Mish. A lot of times when we talk about Bet Mish, we introduce it as one of the oldest LGBTQ congregations in the United States, and that's very true. But Bet Mish is much more than that. Bet Mish is a community, and if you're looking for a community, this is one that you could belong to. It's a place that you will be welcomed. It's a place that you will be seen. It's a place that you will be affirmed. And you might be, I know many of you are here from the dance. You're like, well, I'm not Jewish. I'm here because of the dance. You can come to Bet Mish regardless of who you are. If you are Jewish, if you're a person of deep faith, if you're a person of some faith, if you're a person of no faith, this is another place where you can be part of community. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to try something a little risky. I'm going to tell a joke, and we're going to see how it goes. So, 30 years ago, Houston, Texas, it's Easter, and there's an Easter egg hunt, all right? 30 years ago, Houston, Texas, it's Easter, there's an Easter egg hunt. I met one of the three gentlemen sitting at this table. When I saw that person, it was love at first sight. And I knew I wanted to spend the rest of my life with him, all the rest of my walking days on earth. And I was stricken by how handsome he was, and I said, "Are you Jewish?" And he looked back at me and he said, "No, I'm not." So when we get to the question and answer period of this event, you have three questions you could ask. One, which man was it? Two, did he reciprocate? And three, if he said, "No, I'm not Jewish, what are we doing at a shul?" With that, I will go ahead with the introductions, and I want to make sure I get everybody's name right. So first of all, we have Ephraim Katsir, who's sitting right beside me here. And this is really important. He's the founder of SHIN, which is the Sephardic Heritage International. It's a big deal to be a founder of something. It takes vision, so we're grateful to have him here today. The second panelist that we have is Ori Saltis. He is a professor at Georgetown. And like many learned people, he has much writing, and I'm hoping that he will talk about that writing today as part of his presentation. This is one of the books, New Mexico's Crypto-Jews, in which he has an essay. And then the last person we have at the table is Jose Alfredo Gomez. In his professional life, he is the director of a policy portfolio on climate change at the Government Accountability Office, which is the research investigative arm of Congress. He too is a member of Bet Mish. And so what we're going to do is we're going to give each of them a chance to briefly introduce themselves, about a sentence, and then we're going to come back and each is going to give you about 10 minutes of their viewpoint on what it means to be a converso. And then we're going to do some cross-talking, and then we would invite you to participate. All right? So Ephraim, I'm going to give you the mic first.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. Besides being part of it, because it's the first time I've ever been asked to speak at anything LGBTQ plus related. So, welcome. And well, you've heard a bit about me already. That Sephardic Heritage International in DC, the founding director. And the organization celebrates and raises awareness of Sephardic and other underrepresented Jewish heritages or communities. And part of that relates to Conversos. But there are so many different communities that go along with that are part of that mission, and for which people need to have more awareness, and we can learn from each community by focusing on the potential of various Jewish heritages for cross-cultural bridge building. The organization engages in cultural diplomacy by bringing together diverse communities and working closely with the diplomatic community and the US Congress. And I'll say one more thing about the organization for now, which is we established the annual Congressional Holocaust Commemoration, where Pfizer CEO Albert Bourla, a Sephardic Jew from Greece, shared his family's tragic story during the Holocaust for the first time ever publicly. And the same way so as one point is that we need to work together to raise awareness of all of our various experiences and histories. And that's what I do as I build relationships on a daily basis. Just a lot of personal stuff about me. I love cultural and arts festivals in the district. This included the Turkish festival, which we just had, and we had a positive experience. We had our yellow ribbon there at our booth, and that's what we do. We put ourselves out there, and being here with you, also putting ourselves out there. We each are, and that's something that I appreciate.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Maurice Saltis, and as you heard, I teach at Georgetown. I teach art history, theology, and philosophy. History, cross disciplines. Much of what I do is inter everything else, and that's true of my writing. And I used to direct the B'nai B'rith Classic National Jewish Museum, which since it no longer exists, I don't have to tell you about or try and sell you memberships to. But in my exhibit life and in my writing life and in my teaching and lecturing life, it tends to be across different whatevers. I write on Jewish, Christian, Muslim mysticism, symbols of Jewish, Christian, Muslim art, searching for God across human history, those kinds of topics. So this is about as natural a habitat as I can imagine to be in. So, and I'll say it's not a pleasure to be here, just to be different. But I'm thank you.
And last but not least, I am Alfredo Gomez, so I am a member of Bet Mishpacha. As Patrick said, we both work at GAO. And so I've been a member of Bet Mishpacha now, I think going on 5 years. And as you'll hear from my story, which starts with a box of documents, old documents, I am a converso myself and did convert to Judaism officially last year. So back to you, Patrick.
All right, very good. Thank you for the brief introductions, and they were also insightful and informative. So we decided that we were going to start with Ori, because Ori has the deep knowledge of a professor, and he's going to sort of lay out the terrain of what we know about Conversos and who they are in their history. And if I have that wrong, you can correct me or you can change course. But we'll start with Ori.
Yes, I did. Indeed. So the story, of course, begins not where you would expect and not with whom you would expect and not when you would expect. It begins in Italy in the 13th century when the papacy, having all kinds of issues and problems, one of them being heresy. And there has emerged a new heresy called the Cathar heresy at that point in time. The other being monastic orders that have become too grounded and therefore too powerful and therefore pose a threat to papal authority. Against that backdrop, two different orders are given the imprimatur in the first third of the 13th century, the Franciscan, well, the wrong order, the Dominican and the Franciscan orders. And their particular point and purpose is to inquire into proper faith for professing Christians. And they don't establish themselves in a place. They're mendicant orders. They wander with begging bowls. Whatever you put in that bowl, they'll eat. And so they preach, they teach, they beg, perfect partnership. And really for the first century or two of the conduct of what would better be known as the Inquisition, it was a fairly benign affair. We set up a table here, me and my fellow inquisitors, and you come and we say, so my son, tell me about your Christian beliefs. No, that's not quite right. You need to correct that. But two things occur gradually. One, working through Sicily into Spain, and two, working through time, it becomes less benign. We may have to put a few screws in your thumbs in order to make sure you're convinced that you're not quite believing correctly. So it becomes more physical. And what happens in Spain by the end of the 14th and the beginning of the 15th centuries, and that's where Joe comes in, or his comment about forced conversions, is that riots break out for the first time ever since the early 7th century against Jewish communities in Christian Spain, beginning in Sevilla around Easter time of 1391. And until 1415, there are continuous riots, a consequence of which is that Spain, which may have had as many as 1 million Jews out of a population of about 11 million at that point, a third of them left. A third of them stuck to their guns and stayed Jewish, and a third of them under duress became Catholic or became Christian, because the way we use the word Catholic doesn't exist yet. We haven't gotten to the Reformation, but we can use whichever word we want, Christian or Catholic, for convenience. And that means that after 1415, the population of nominally Christian Spain, which at that point is about 80% of the Iberian Peninsula, has old Christians, it has new Christians, nuevos cristianos, conversos, it has old Jews, it also has still a Muslim population, although most Muslims would have moved into the southeast corner at that point, which is still under Muslim control. The problem that emerges in the course of the 15th century is that as the Dominican order becomes more and more powerful, it also becomes more and more concerned about a particular kind of heresy, the Judaizing heresy. So someone who, having been born Jewish, who is baptized to become Christian, doing so under duress, actually continues in hiding to be Jewish, a crypto-Jew. So I go to church on Sunday, I go to Mass, I listen to the sermon, I do all that I'm supposed to do, but Friday night, I lit candles and I said a blessing over them for Shabbat. And I brought out a goblet of wine and I said a blessing over that. I celebrate Easter, but I'm also only eating unleavened bread during the week that's very close to Easter of Passover. I manage to fast during the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. Those are now heretical actions because nominally I'm Christian, I've been baptized. An open Jew can do that stuff. I can't. It becomes problematic. And to cut to the chase and make a long story short, by the end of the century, let me be more precise, by the late 1480s, a couple of things have happened. One is that the inquisitional authorities, plural, in diverse places, fall under one roof, into the hands of a guy by the name of Tomás de Torquemada. All four, count them, of his grandparents had been Jews. So it's not just that he is a converso just 2 generations removed, but I would imagine he's got something to prove about how genuinely Christian Catholic he is. And the chief inquisitor, he's going to be more rigorous dealing with the Judaizing heresy than someone who comes from generations of Christians might be. And by the end of the 1480s, he has also become allied in a very direct way with the Queen of Old Castilla, Isabel, whose personal confessor he was, and the guy she marries, with help primarily from conversos, wealthy conversos, clearly known, still really behind the doors to be Jewish, but they're wealthy, they can get away with it, who helped provide the funds for Ferdinand, the King of Aragon, to marry Isabel, de facto unifying Christian Spain, and that makes possible the conquest of the remaining Muslim part of Spain in the southeast of Granada by January 1492. The other thing is Fernando has coffers that are fairly empty. And he teams up with Tomás de Torquemada, and the Inquisition becomes a much more vigorous, violent, and vicious operation. Nominally, I remind you, it has nothing to do with Jews. It's heresy. So it's Christians who are accused of heresy. In this case, it's the Judaizing heresy. When you are invited to the inquisitional authorities, you are not told who accused you and of what you've been accused. What happens is you end up in prison, everything is confiscated, divided between church and state, so the coffers of both are being enriched at your expense. And if on the rare occasion somehow you would be let go, you don't get any of that stuff back. More often than not, you wouldn't be. But the problem is, we still have that heresy apparently abounding. So by March, April of 1492, Ferdinand, the king now of a unified Iberian Peninsula, announces that any openly professing Jews will be expelled. They have to leave by August 2nd, because the presumed reason for the ongoing problem of the Judaizing heresies, you still have openly professing Jews who are drawing their former co-religionists back into the heresy of acting Jewishly whether or not. So those whom we call Sephardi because Sfarad by then is the Hebrew word for Spain. That's another story in and of itself. So Jews who trace themselves to Spain and Portugal would end up being called Sephardim, go where they can. Bayezid II, the Ottoman Sultan, invites them to come to Ottoman lands. So a lot of them go there for reasons beyond this discussion. If you want to ask me during Q&A, I'll be happy to address that. They go in different directions. They go to the south of France, Avignon, which is under the control of the papacy because the Inquisition has become something beyond papal control. So here's irony for you. The papacy is protecting Jews who otherwise might be at risk because of being confused with conversos by the Inquisition authorities. They went to Amsterdam. That has two consequences. One, we see when in the aftermath of within the age of religious wars, the independence that the 7 northern Netherlandish provinces gained from Catholicism, establishing their own Dutch Reform Calvinist style church, Amsterdam becomes a very open community, and Jews are able to go there. Catholics live there, but it's primarily Protestant, and so on. The problem is this. Former Jews who have stayed behind in Spain because they're conversos, they're nuevos cristianos, but who for one reason or another decide, you know what, I want to go back openly to my Judaism, who go to Amsterdam where they can, could be a little bit paranoid. What if the Catholics took over again? Because the age of religious wars ain't over. It's in the middle of things. And one of the consequences of that, just one example, is a guy by the name, you've probably heard the name of Benedict Spinoza, who is accused of heretical beliefs from within his Judaism, and there is no heretical Judaism. The concept doesn't exist up to that point. He comes his grandparents from Portugal, by the Sephardic rabbis leading the Sephardic Jewish community in Amsterdam, partially because they're paranoid, as I just suggested, partially because they're pissed off because he had a fight with his half-sister and her husband over their father's will. And he went to the outside courts to have it adjudicated. By the way, he won it. He turned over all of the wealth, it wasn't a lot of it, but all of it to his sister. He didn't care. It had been the principle that he wanted his father's will to be taken care of. He hadn't written anything yet. So the heretical views of which he was accused were all hearsay, promoted almost surely by his brother-in-law, a very jealous and angry guy. Spinoza himself wasn't particular. He never left, but neither did he stay in the Jewish community. And that's another story. Another part of the Amsterdam part of the Sephardic diaspora from within the Jewish diaspora is that when a community established itself in the east coast of Brazil, in places like the coastal town of Recife, when the Dutch and the Portuguese between 1645 and 54 were engaged in a war, and eventually at the end of the 9 years, the Portuguese won. The Portuguese admiral in the summer of 1654 said to the leaders of the Jewish community, you know, among you, probably many of you, most of you, are former Christians, so you are in trouble when the Inquisition arrives. I can hold them off for a couple of months, but you guys gotta leave. And as everybody probably knows, a group of 23 of them ended up not heading back to Amsterdam, but to New Amsterdam, establishing the first Jewish community in North America. And again, that's another story. Peter Stuyvesant wasn't happy about them coming there, not because he was anti-Jewish, because he was anti-anyone who wasn't Dutch Reform. He was an equal opportunity bigot. But unfortunately for him, 7 members of the Board of Governors of the Dutch West India Company, who was his employer, it wasn't the Dutch state, it was a private company, were Jews. And so the word came back, no, they get to stay. So this becomes the beginning of the Jewish community in North America. If we look to the south, back where that community began in Brazil, and in between we get to Mexico, or as it was known, New Spain. The Inquisition arrives in 1571 into New Spain. And with it, of course, comes the same danger that attached itself to any former Jew become Christian in danger of being accused of a Judaizing heresy when the Inquisition comes in. And by the way, of course, in South and Central America, what became an even more intense focus for the Inquisition authorities were the Native Americans, the indigenous people, who embraced Catholicism, but of course still practiced things that they practiced that now become heretical. So there seems to have been a community of Jews, former Christians, former Jews, former Christians, conversos, who left the center, Mexico City, and went as far away as they could get into New Spain, in what eventuated as what we call New Mexico in the United States. And that community eventually loses its identity, except for odd things. Like every Friday night, because my father and my grandfather and my mother and my grandmother did this, I open this cabinet and I pull out these candlesticks and I light them. And usually the evening is over, you blow out the candles. These I let burn all the way down. There's a goblet, I fill it with wine and I put it on the table. Saturday night, I put them back into that cabinet hidden away. I don't even remember why I do it, but I've been doing it and we've been doing it for generations. In 1992, the quincentennial, both of the expulsion and of course of Columbus's first voyage, an interest emerges on the whole idea, not just of the Sephardim, but specifically of the Converso population of Sephardim, and what had happened to it and where it had gotten in different places. And in New Mexico in particular, there emerges a renewed interest in and consciousness on the part of a whole range of different Catholics who realize and recognize when they start to hear and read about this stuff, oh, my ancestry is Jewish. And there are any number of individuals of that ilk. For example, Father William Saunders, he's pictured in this book, I'll say a word about it in a moment, who's very comfortable with his dual identity. The photograph that Carrie Hertz took of him has him blowing this beautiful shofar in his church. Then there's someone like Joseph Garcia, who when he recognized his Jewish roots, ended up not only converting to Jewish, becoming a converso, but as a rabbi. So he's Rabbi Yosef Garcia. He's in there as well. And there are dozens more. I wrote this essay at Carrie's behest because she was part of an exhibition that I curated that was in New Mexico around the turn of the millennium. I forget, it was 99, 2000, 2001, something like that, called Jewish Artists, on the Edge. And her photographs were in it, and we got into conversations. So she got funds from New Mexico to do this book. She said, would you write the essay? That's how I became involved with it. So here's the interesting thing, 3 last things, and I know we're on the clock. I'm good, am I good? Okay. But there are 3 things anyway that I do want to add. So 2 sort of perspectives. You have coming out of the woodwork a whole range of individuals from 92 and following, individuals recognizing their Jewish heritage and returning to it or not. Because, you know, we've been Catholic now for 6 generations. That's who I am. I'm proud of that piece of my heritage, but I don't see any reason to go back to it. Others, like Rabbi Yosef Garcia, who makes a beeline, not only to go back to it, but to become very prominent as a leader of the community within it. You know, when you become Jewish, you're going from circumcision to bar mitzvah to the particulars of the wedding ceremony to the particulars of the funerary ceremony. It's a whole life cycle change, which you want, you don't want. And the kind of physical evidence is not just my grandparents pulled out and I pulled out a goblet and candlesticks out of the cabinet, but I always wondered why the gravestone of my grandfather had both the Star of David, which historically is not necessarily, but in this context almost certainly is a Jewish symbol, flanked by two crosses, or a cross flanked by two stars of David. And there's Hebrew writing that I could never read on that gravestone, to which his name had been added. The Hebrew writing is the first half of the Ten Commandments. It was half of a Decalogue that had come from some synagogue that ended up being used in this for this nominally Christian gravestone by someone very aware of who the person deceased was in terms of that identity. But now 2 generations, I was my grandfather. I don't understand why. Now I understand, after 92 and all the investigations that were going on. The second, interestingly, is the counter push. Actually, it's a former student of mine. I'm not embarrassed to say, but it is a former student of mine, but she likes to make trouble, I think. She said, no, these are all fake. They're false Jews. They're crypto Jews. At the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, when Protestant America was moving west, it was much more advantageous to be perceived as someone whose ancestry was in Europe, in Spain, than someone whose ancestry was indigenous. So they fabricated these historical pasts of having had ancestry that originated in Spain rather than it being true. And her alleged proof for this is DNA. Well, I'm someone who doesn't have a huge amount of faith in DNA studies that take you back 15 generations as if they can be so precise. So it's interesting that, and I think to this day she maintains that view. I disagree on 2 levels. One, because I find the other sort of evidence convincing enough. And more fundamentally, you know what? You are who you want to be. You are who you want to be. I am who I want to be. Don't tell me that I'm not Jewish just because you are certain by your DNA study of me that I'm not. I did one of those 23andMe things. When I finally got the results, I was informed that I'm related to someone named Daphne Salters on Long Island. I said, really? Thank you, my sister. So I found nothing that was particularly illuminating in that study, which doesn't mean people don't find illuminating stuff. I'm just saying that the buck doesn't stop with that kind of evidence as far as I'm concerned. And the last thing, because this has been a rapid review of history of the past, moving toward the present, is obviously the future. So if one considers both the Sephardic world within the Jewish world and the Jewish world within the world at large, one of the things that all 3 of those levels of world have is diversity in common with each other. It's diversity. So this whole story to me is just another branch in the diversity tree, and as magnificent and beautiful a tree as one could hope to have. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ori. I'm going to ask you to do 2 things before you pass your mic. I'm going to ask you to help me set up Alfredo and Ephraim. Ephraim does this thing called cultural diplomacy, and I get the cultural part. It's the diplomacy part that's interesting and why there has to be diplomacy. So I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about what being Conversos and their movement meant for cultures so that we can get to this idea of diplomacy. And also to set up Fredo, can you tell us like where the centers of the populations were? Like where were the major centers where Conversos ended up?
Sure. So in the first case, the cultural part is, I think, beautifully complex because I see there are 2 parts of it and they're almost at war with each other. One is coming from Spain, and Spain had this concept of purity of blood. And I see that historically as having imposed itself within the Sephardic community. So they maintained a sense of a certain purity of blood and superiority to the rest of the Jewish world, which becomes ironic when they come to the United States, where they are the initial community. But by the middle of the 19th century, they're overwhelmed population-wise by Ashkenazi Jews for whom, wait, you can't be Jewish, you don't speak Yiddish, you know, that kind of a thing. So I think it's a very fascinating, well, it's a very fascinating phenomenon, but also diplomacy for sure. I don't like any kind of supersessionist or sense of superiority anythingism. So cultural, religious, or otherwise. Alas, I find it too common feature of humanity, and Jews are by no means exempt from that feature, and the Sephardic Jews aren't exempt from it, but then neither are the Mizrahi or the Ashkenazi Jews. So that's my sort of cultural comment. In terms of setters, leaving Spain, so they established themselves, first of all, across North Africa in different places, from Fez to Cairo, but even more pronouncedly in Constantinople, which had just recently become Istanbul, right? This is 1492 and the years following. And Turkey remained a place, even during the Holocaust, to which Jews could come as refuge. Amsterdam was another place. Avignon, and there are two little communities, Cavaillon and Carpentras, south and north of Avignon. That's part of the Papal territories that I mentioned, where there were the many Sephardic Jews located. Also in Germany, oddly enough, in particular, eventually, some in Berlin, another converso by the name of Uriel Acosta, half a generation prior to Spinoza, when he had to leave Amsterdam, went to Germany, but he ended up coming back to Amsterdam. And then you have an odd thing. Part of the reason that Spinoza was excommunicated is that the more liberal of the two Sephardic rabbis, Agabed and Manasseh in Israel, was not in town when the final trial took place. By the way, Spinoza didn't even show up for it. That's how much he cared. He was over in England convincing Cromwell to rescind the decree of expulsion that had been meted out back in 1290. Now we're talking 1650-ish, okay? So a lot of Sephardim came and established themselves in London. And of course, in South America and by way of Recife, in New York, in Charleston, along the eastern seaboard. By about the year 1800, there are about 7,000 Jews in the United States. Probably 90% of them are Sephardim. And again, that eventually changes. So yeah, different places and a lot of need for diplomacy always with human relations.
Thank you so much. We're going to go to Alfredo next. We're saving Ephraim for last because he's going to be sharing resources, and we think that's one of the most important things. So we'll go now to Mr. Gomez.
Okay, so I want to pick up where Professor Soltis is finishing, because my story is many of my ancestors are leaving Spain in the early 1500s, mid 1600s, and coming to New Spain, what is now Mexico. And they go north, as Ori was saying, but they also go to northern Mexico, northeast Mexico. And there was a pretty well-known conquistador, Luis Carvajal de la Cueva el Viejo, meaning the elder, who had gotten a sort of land grant from the King of Spain to settle El Nuevo Reino de León, which means just now it's the state of Nuevo León in northeast Mexico. But he doesn't have to show that the people he's bringing have this purity of blood test, which means that you can't be Jewish or Muslim 3 generations back. You're not allowed to go to the colonies. That requirement is just put to the side. So Carvajal goes to this region of Spain and Portugal and brings back, I believe, like 200 families who go to northern Mexico. And so he becomes a pretty successful territorial governor, but then he comes under the investigation of the Mexican Inquisition and is arrested in 1591 and dies in prison. Meanwhile, his sister in Mexico City and her older children are also arrested by the Inquisition, and they relapsed back into, so what would happen in these Inquisition trials is that you would commit to be a good Christian again, but you would still continue to be investigated or, watched. And so the whole family relapses, and so they're rearrested and they're burned at the stake in 1596 in Mexico City. So that's sort of some historical context just about this part of Mexico. This is Mexico City, but then northern Mexico as well. And so myself and my family, we have been in that region of Mexico for over 400 years. I, started my comments earlier about a box of documents. And so the box of documents that I'm referring to was my dad, because I was born in Mexico and came to the US when I was 10. My dad asked one of my brothers who was going to our home in Mexico to bring back this box of documents that we had, so that we could have them in the US as well. And so my sister and I went through it, and in this box of documents was this document granting my grandfather use of lands because he was a descendant of a big land grant that was awarded to Capitan Francisco Baez de Benavides, who I, by the way, already knew was a converso, who also had been investigated by the Mexican Inquisition and arrested, but then released. And it was also a genealogy document. And so that sort of piqued my interest into genealogy, which then I got into it. So I knew the history of like my state in Mexico, but I just didn't know how I was connected to it. And so it was through genealogy and this box of old documents and this land grant document that sort of started my interest in genealogy, and then of course come to discover that there were many families in the state of Nuevo León that were also, by historians and academics, all agree were conversos, especially because there are Inquisition records back in Spain of their ancestors being arrested and being burned at the stake as well. So, and families like the La Garza family, also the La Cerda is also proved by genealogy, ancestry by DNA that they're in fact Sephardic, they're in fact Semitic. So there was a number of families, and in fact, if Patrick, you want to hold up, and Joe knows what I'm talking about. There's a book there that was published by an American author called The Conquistadors and Crypto Jews of Monterrey. So it's just a history of some of the founders of the city of Monterrey, which is the capital of Nuevo León. And so he also goes back to Spain and the Canary Islands, which were part of Spain at the time, sort of with records from the Inquisition as well for a number of trials for some of the families. So I decided then that if I was going to embark on this sort of historical documentation for my family and sort of discovering that, yes, in fact, I am a descendant of many of the Converso families, and I had grown up in small towns in Mexico. And so the other thing, Ori was talking about some of these customs that in New Mexico, people practice. And I had the opportunity through my professional life to spend a lot of time in New Mexico in the small towns. And one of the discoveries that I made on my own was like, wow, these small towns in New Mexico are very similar to my towns in Nuevo León in Northeast Mexico, in the sense that we also had these customs that, were a little peculiar. And when I asked my family about them, we're like, well, that's just what we did. Custom. Things like dietary habits, we didn't, pork was forbidden. There were other sort of foods that we made that were apparently also Sephardic in origin. There were some funeral practices that we also did that were also Sephardic in practice, covering mirrors when people die, burying the body quickly, the care that you take with it. But we just did them because everybody did them in the small towns. And so come to realize that, well, no, Mexicans eat pork, it's quite tasty. So, and so, I began to sort of connect the dots and go, oh, even though we've been Catholic for centuries, we sort of adhere to some of these things. I think for us in Nuevo León, the oral histories were lost. There were candles lit, but then Catholics also lit all the candles. So it's like, and so for me, I was like, okay, well, this is interesting. What do I want to do with this? And so I then decided, well, I want to reconnect with this heritage. And so I want to pursue converting to Judaism. So, and having been in DC, we reached out to Bet Mishpachah, and they were very welcoming and embracing. And so we worked with our rabbi here, and 3.5 year of study ended with the official conversion. And just to share some sort of interesting things, obviously one of the things you have to do, for those of you that aren't Jewish, when you convert, is that you have to choose a Hebrew name. And so I sort of gave that some thought and wasn't sure where I'd land. So I talk to our group of rabbis, because there's a whole committee, it's like getting a dissertation, you know, you've got to go in front of folks. And so what I decided to do was actually look at my history and just take a name that it was based from a Converso background, and that is the name of Benavides, which is my grandfather's last name. And by the way, through genealogy, I have a lot of Benavides. And so one of the jokes in our state in Mexico, in northern Mexico, is that we're all cousins because we're all related, because we all intermarried each other over and over and over and over again. So glad we left, because now we don't do that anymore. So, just joking. But we all call each other primo, right? But Benavides is one of those last names in Northeast Mexico, again, coming from Capitan Baez de Benavides. And so I took part of that name, which is Benavi, which is apparently a current Israeli name, which means son of the father. So that became my Hebrew name, taking my grandfather's name and using it for this purpose. So the other thing I want to mention about the other things that I've been doing as well. So, you know, Professor was giving you this great historical context, you know, and so one of the things that Spain did in Portugal a few years ago is they passed laws allowing descendants of Sephardic communities or conversos to apply for citizenship. So since I'd already done my genealogy and I had all these reports and stuff, I was like, well, you know, I'd gone to Spain, it was nice, so it's good to have an exit strategy if we need it. So, and so I did apply for Spanish citizenship and went through the process of, so Spain had set up a really, I mean, it's kind of crazy because it was a long process. It's been 5 years in the making. And just last week, I had my appointment with the Spanish consulate where I'm one step closer to getting my Spanish passport. But we went to Spain in 2019 before the pandemic to sign all the paperwork, and then got approved 2 years ago, and then finally went into the consulate. And now it's just an issue of waiting for a few more things to come in. But that's a process that I decided to go through, and so I will be able to take that as well. So, Patrick, I think I'm going to stop there, and happy to answer questions, unless there's something else you wanted me to address.
We're going to get to Ephraim in a minute, but I want you to sort of build on two things. One, everybody in this room at some point in their life, whether it was when they were 16 or when they realized their sexuality or went through a divorce or went through a death, in some way their identity changed and they reflected on the change in their identity. So your realization that you were Jewish, I mean, did that liberate you? Did that edify you? Did it?
I think more, again, because knowing the history of my state and sort of where I grew up and what we did, and obviously coming to the US was a big change because then we discovered ham, and it's like, oh, that's quite tasty, you know? And so, you know, it was more like, it made a lot of sense. Like,
Yeah.
it was like connecting the dots, and it's like, well, you know, like, for example, I have a big family in Texas, and half of them were very intrigued by, you know, what I was learning and my whole conversion process. The other half, you know, they're more like interested in the future and not so much looking back. So, but what I do want to say is there are a lot of people from Monterrey and the state of Nuevo León who have applied for citizenship and have gotten it because we all share the same ancestors. But what's interesting about the group in Monterrey is they have maintained their Catholicism, but are embracing sort of this heritage and history, and they haven't so much sought out conversion. So I know of a couple of people like myself who have converted to Judaism and share the same background and history, but perhaps Ephraim can also talk a little bit about, or others about, in some places, like in Latin America, like in Monterrey, Mexico City, I don't think that the Jewish communities are as open, as accepting for conversos to come in and convert. And maybe that has to do more with, well, actually, I don't know. But I'm fortunate that here in DC, we have a very accepting, and not just in Bet Mishpachah, but some of the other synagogues where we have interacted with have also been accepting, and community in general is accepting, although our rabbi did tell us that, hey, you are gonna meet people that tell you, no, you're not a Jew, you're not a real Jew, and, hey, growing up gay and an immigrant, there's plenty of things that we're told, and it's like, we're fine, we're gonna be resilient, so.
One last question. Bet Mish is known for being the LGBTQ, congregation in the city and in America. Your life is very gay. We have these wonderful gay people who came here today just to see you. So like you're embedded in gay. We've got like. So what does Bet Mish give you? You don't need gay from Bet Mish.
I think Bet Mish gives me community, that wasn't a part of, and a community where, as a Jew or a new Jew or a renewed Jew, I know what it means to be Jewish now. Whereas before joining Bet Mish, I didn't know what that meant. And coming through services, through the High Holy Days, through liturgy, and so it has given me a lot of meaning.
Well, pass your mic down to Ephraim. We've saved the best for last, not to discount from the other two, but we saved Ephraim because, again, he is the founder of Shin, and he gave us really the theme for this panel, which was building bridges and how you sort of do that. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
So it's the organization is purposely called Sephardic Heritage International because we wanted to be able to connect with people in as broad of a way as possible. So it doesn't matter whether you're Jewish or not. You can still come and appreciate the programs that we have, whether it's Mimoon at the Smithsonian or an art exhibit at the State Department, if they let you in. But the idea is that there are people, it helps people in different ways because there are people who come from Sephardic families and have a long line, but don't know everything. Well, who does? But are not always aware of all of the traditions. And so the programs provide something for them. But at the same time, you have people who won't walk into a synagogue, and a Sephardic synagogue. It could be because maybe there's too much homophobia there. And so where are you going to engage your Sephardic culture, heritage? I know there are many Sephardim even in this city who do not go to Sephardic synagogues. And part of that is that they don't connect for one reason or another. And so we felt the need to create something that, one, raises awareness to help folks who come from different places, different perspectives, but also, really, it's a beautiful heritage. It's very diverse, first of all, what can fall under that rubric. And to be able to highlight that because you don't get it in Jewish schools so much. I mean, it's getting better. One of the things that comes to mind is we've been raising awareness of Sephardic experiences of the Holocaust for years. And this was the first year that a Jewish school, asked us to do a program for that. And so people are becoming more aware, and also in Israel, in the curriculum, there's not much about that either. There was a commission that was put together that identified these issues, but still nothing has been done. At that time, it was Naftali Bennett headed the commission. He was at the Ministry of Education and headed that. But many things have happened since then, but things have not changed. So there are different parts of this. Is that there's this beautiful heritage that allows us to build bridges because it is so diverse. Because what's diplomacy? I think of it as finding common ground to build on. I once saw someone created a Jewish Muslim coalition in New York without a single Jew from a Muslim majority country. Let's build bridges, I mean, I don't really think of myself really as building bridges. It's just finding bridges that are already there. But building bridges raises more money, so I'll say that. We're building, but really we're just rediscovering bridges that are already there. And think about it, when we do Mimuna and Moroccan Jews come and see, or Moroccans who are not Jewish come and say, oh my gosh, they're Moroccan Jews. There's a guy who grew up in the Jewish quarter in Fez, never met a Jew in his life. And he said, but I always heard from my grandparents about how things were, good times. I mean, and he said, I want to experience that. And that's the beginning of Mimuna, the Smithsonian. Finding that common ground. So, go back a little bit. We were talking about the Inquisition and Conversos. And there's a very particular kind of anti-Semitism that comes out of the Inquisition. And I've heard someone say, particularly from Isabella la Católica herself, which is this idea of limpieza de sangre, of purity of blood. It's a very anti-Semitic idea. That no matter you become a new Christian, but you're somehow still tainted. The sad part is, unfortunately, that we have these ideas in the Jewish community as well. And so we also have to learn the lessons of the Inquisition. And in fact, if you look at one community that I connect to very closely, is the Spanish and Portuguese community. It's probably the Sephardic community that is the most welcoming to LGBTQ plus folks. In fact, their reverends are, they use this old terminology because having been here since colonial America and use terms like reverend. And so one of the reverends who's now actually working to recreate a school, a Jewish school, he's gay. But I was telling you some other things that I appreciate. It's also a very, there's a lot of focus on reasoning and as opposed to mysticism. That's not for everyone. But the thing that I appreciate most is that one of the, and nowhere is perfect. So I'm not saying that this is a perfect, I'm telling you the things that I appreciate about the Spanish and Portuguese. I would say, first of all, it's the one part of Judaism that is most intimately connected to the identity of Conversos. Because Spanish and Portuguese communities were founded by Conversos. And there's a rabbi in Israel, Rabbi Cardoso, who comes from Amsterdam. And he said, one of the beautiful things about the Spanish and Portuguese tradition, which by the way, it's beautiful, there's beautiful music, there's a choir, there's an organ in many of these places. They commission music. It's still Sephardic. It still has this Middle Eastern thing to it, but it's Baroque at the same time. It messes with your head. But one of the things he said is that when they came to Amsterdam, no one knew anything about being Jewish, but they figured it out. And not only did they figure it out, they figured it out in ways that transcended other areas of Judaism. Show me another tradition with that kind of development of the music. Well, someone might say maybe Yekkas, but Yekkas actually are very influenced by Spanish and Portuguese Jews and often saw Spain, the golden age of Spain, as something to look to as a model. So, so this idea of being against this idea of purity of blood is something that's very much at the core of Spanish and Portuguese Judaism. That unfortunately today there are people who, within the Jewish communities, who still need this lesson, and that's why we remember the Holocaust, and we learn the lessons from the Holocaust, but we also need to learn the lessons of the Inquisition, and that's one of them. Judaism is not about blood. Being Sephardic is not about blood. Being Ashkenazi is not about blood. Not that you can't connect to that, but that does not take away from someone else's experience of Judaism. And so coming back now to Conversos, there's a diversity of stories. I mean, it's the same way within the Sephardic world, there's a lot of diversity. I can tell you I know someone who also she found a box of things, like you did in Venezuela. She was working at Taco Bell, and this Persian Jewish guy fell in love with her. They've now been married for a long time. She has a cookbook. If you're interested in getting it, speak to me. She tells her story in the cookbook. And I belonged to a synagogue with this rabbi who was Syrian, not so tightly connected to the communities in New York and New Jersey, but still Syrian. And he never did a conversion in his life. Well, he said converts were always welcome in his congregation. And in fact, there was a guy who'd been there for many years that never actually made the decision. But he was always welcome, part of the services, everything, professor. But one day this young woman comes to him, and she's from this little rural part in northern Puerto Rico. And for the first time, he decided to supervise a conversion because he was so touched by her story. And that's what it's about. Somewhere between them, they found some common ground. And he decided, I'm going to help you. Which is even a step maybe beyond welcoming, maybe, I don't know. I can see what you need, I see you. And I'm going to help you with that. So this idea of being welcoming and finding common ground is very much at the core of what Sephardic Heritage International is. And I can tell you Sephardic Jewry, history, culture, it's marginalized. It's marginalized in Jewish education in this country, it's marginalized Jewish education in Israel, God knows where else. But also the story of Conversos is also marginalized. It's not centered in many places, including within Sephardic Judaism. Never seen a synagogue except to remember the Inquisition. Maybe there are couples, who maybe do that. And so I can tell you a bit about the resources that we have, or that we're creating. I always say about driving the car while building it. And so we're creating a museum, the Multicultural Jewish Arts Museum. It's a project of Shin DC. And it's, at least for now, it would be GC's only Jewish arts. It's GC's only Jewish arts museum. We have collection. We don't have walls, building. We don't have brick and mortar. But we've been doing exhibitions around the city. We've done them on the Hill. We've done them in the State Department. We've done them at other museums here. And we're building those collections. And Uri to help you with a lot of that. The curator. And so it's also it would be the world's first Sephardic arts museum. Am I correct? Yeah. So Sephardic Jewish communities originated in diverse countries. And part of our narrative is Conversos. Whether so-and-so likes it or not, it's part of our narrative. In fact, in many countries, where Jews went to, you don't necessarily even know. Give you an example. There's a woman who was born a slave on the island of Barbados. Her father was the president of the Sephardic synagogue in Bridgetown. Her name was Sarah Brandon Rodriguez. And when she was freed, she became part of the Jewish community. That's how it works. And she and her brother, they were both freed, and they went to Suriname, where they came into their own before they were connected with their shidduchim, their matches in New York that their father arranged for them. Very lucrative matches, but not that they needed it. And where are their descendants today? All over. His second wife, well, we call the first one, but second mother of his children, were married off to the wealthiest Jews in London. And she was known for her very blonde hair. In fact, there's a portrait of her with a locket of her hair behind it because it was so impressive. And some of them married Moroccans. So some of these Conversos descendants end up in Morocco, or the old English Jewish community. That's why, it's so easy for people to compartmentalize and say, oh, this is not part of us, but it's all part of us. And so the museum that we're creating would bring into focus the multifaceted, first of all, let me just say, so that part of the communities originating in countries as diverse as Morocco, Syria, Turkey, India, Jamaica. One of these boats coming from Recife ended up in Jamaica. And the Iberian Peninsula, the rich history of these communities, while often underrepresented in American Jewish discourse, provides important lessons on multicultural enrichment and coexistence. And I would say beyond that, it also teaches us ethics. What you see in terms of the Inquisition and this whole thing about purity of blood is unethical, it's disgusting. And it might sound weird, but it's among us as well. There's some parts that just need to be dealt with. And so we learn important lessons from each other. And these are lessons that are not just beneficial to, I would say beneficial to any human being. And that's how we're able to build bridges. And so the museum brings into focus the multifaceted layers of the Jewish experience, the rich cultural links to diverse communities worldwide. And it does throw through the art by creating an arts and community forum. And we call it, well, the Multicultural Jewish Arts Museum. We call it My Jam, M-y, capital J, capital A, capital M, which is My Jam. A Jewish museum for everyone. And this is one of the reasons I've met people from so many different backgrounds. There's a woman who, we were looking at grants, and we had a meeting with her, and she said, I want to help you. Because she said, I have a Sephardic last name. Sure enough, in Morocco and Algeria, the name. And she has no interest in becoming Jewish. But she's still interested in something that she's connected to. There's a common ground. There's something that she feels that she can connect with. And we need spaces that allow people to do that. And so that's one of the reasons why we're looking at why we're creating this museum, why we're building it, to tell all of our stories, because they're so important. Whether it's Sarah Brandon Rodriguez, Alfredo, your story, that we need spaces where we can tell these stories, share these narratives, and that's why it's so important that you're doing this, so that we can learn more from each other, because that's an important part of diplomacy.
Thank you. Excellent. All right, we're going to have time now for questions and answers. For those of you who aren't going to go home, though, and discover a box of documents that make you a converso, some other things that you can think about, and I'm going to build on what Ephraim said, the importance of being authentic, right? All of us as gay people have learned the importance of being authentic, the importance of creating spaces where people can be authentic, the importance of not saying to someone, well, you can't be that. You can't be trans, you can't be non-binary, you can't use that pronoun. So I think there are a lot of lessons that we have here that go well beyond the topic. You guys were fantastic. I mean, I knew when I met you, you would be fantastic, but you're better than I did. All right, I'm gonna walk around with the mic.
The chat and
All right, you
And
wanna
may I make two little quick comments before? One, apropos of something that you said, Alfredo, you know, there was already a heavy debate in the 13th and 14th centuries within the Jewish community as to whether conversos who want to come back should be welcomed or not. And the Rhineland rabbis said absolutely not. If you couldn't stick it out, that was basically their idea, it was punitive. The Maimonideans said, on the contrary, you should embrace anybody, everybody who wants to come in. So that's an old story, alas. The second, I highly recommend, Elie Wiesel has a series of stories called Legends of Our Time. One of them is an incident at Saragossa. He's visiting Saragossa. This guy keeps bugging me, wants to show him around. Finally says, okay, show me around. And they get into conversation. What languages do you speak? Wiesel says, well, I speak this, I speak Hebrew. Hebreo. You speak Hebrew. Wait, you have to come home with me. He's got this document that he can't read. And Wiesel reads it and he says, your ancestors were Jews. It's a document that says, I, Abraham, the son of Benjamin, I want my descendants to know, End of the first part of the story. Wiesel is covering the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 61. He's coming out of the courtroom, and this guy sort of grabs him, and he's in Wieselian fashion, Jerusalem, madmen, prophets, another one. I says, don't you recognize him? And he suddenly realizes this guy. He drops everything, they go home. He has moved to Israel, brought his family, and he's taken on what I thought of when you said your name, taken on the name he's now called Benjamin, the son of Abraham. He's gotten a document on his wall. It's very spine-tingling story. So read it if you get a chance.
All right, excellent. We're gonna go to the question from the chat and then I'll come around the room.
So the question from the chat is probably for the professor. This is, do you have some sort of estimate in terms of numbers of how many conversos there might be either in the United States and or worldwide?
The best I can do, and it's nothing, it's an estimate, right? A few thousand.
Okay.
Yeah, not more at this
And then
point.
since I have the mic, I'm gonna.
Okay.
So a couple of comments. One is I was in Portugal a year ago, October, and it was a Jewish heritage tour. And our guide was so enmeshed in the Jewish community. And in fact, on one of the last days, we went to a synagogue and had a presentation, and lo and behold, it's his wife. But he's not Jewish. And at some point later in the tour, one of my friends had said to him, have you ever thought about converting? I mean, you're so enmeshed in the community. They practiced all their stuff at home. They went to services, the high holidays, his son played soccer in the Maccabees. I mean, they were just so enmeshed in the community. And his comment was, there's no need for me to convert because it wouldn't change my life. So that's an example of someone embracing, but not necessarily needing to feel like they needed to actually convert to be quote unquote Jewish. So two questions, Alfredo. One is you mentioned that part of your family embraced your journey, part didn't. So I'm just wondering if any other part of your family has also taken the conversion route. And then the other question is for Ephraim, and that is if you could just tell us a little bit about your Sephardic background.
So Mindy, to answer your question, for my immediate family, I'm the only one that has taken the conversion route because I am connected to the broader sort of community of conversos. There have been some distant relatives who have embraced and become Jewish. So, but who knows? My nieces and nephews, some of them, who graduated college, have become interested recently in the discovery. So you just never know.
Yeah, so very mixed Sephardic Jew. All my grandparents came from different places. They migrated to Latin America, but in terms of my practice and philosophy, my Rebbe was Moroccan, and one of my Rebbes is Moroccan, the other one's Syrian. And so when it comes to music and liturgy, I do very much connect to both, but in some places I've had where someone, when you hang out with Syrians, they say, well, they're the best, and when you hang out with Moroccans, they're the best. So I feel like in terms of what I do, I mean, I do the same thing, but I feel it shifts a little bit depending on where I am. And there's also more of, I would also say, when I was in yeshiva, I connected very much with Rav Ovadia Yosef, because he used to come give a shiur once a week. And we were all excited because it was as if people didn't see us, as if we didn't exist, but here they couldn't help but see him. And we felt that when they saw him, they would catch a glimpse of us. And when he would come in full garb, and we would all, the Bachurim Yeshiva would jump and say, there's some particular movement that adds something about the Mashiach after that, but we stopped before that. And only some people. But that's how much it meant to us. And I mean, I don't necessarily agree with everything he has to say, but it's a matter of what he means to me in terms of being seen. And one of the things that I appreciated very much about him is that if it weren't for him, Ethiopians would not have a place in Israel today. If it weren't for him sticking his neck out, because he was an absolutely not racist. In fact, if one single Ethiopian needed help, he would show up. And so these are values that I appreciate in him very much. And someone mentioned Maimonideans. I do very much connect to that as well. So I suppose I would say, as mixed as I am, I have all these different influences, including now, say also the Spanish and Portuguese community.
Excellent. All right, we've got time for at least 4 questions. So we're start with Mark.
This is a wonderful panel. I really appreciate you being here today. Just a few short questions, and you can answer any of them that you
Mark, can you speak closer to the mic?
Yeah, and you can answer any of the questions that you like. I was curious to hear your thoughts about any interrelationship between what are now called Mizrahi Jews and Sephardic Jews, to what extent they interpenetrate as categories. Are they cultural? Are they geographic? Second question, there's been a lot of interest recently in the Sassoon family and their heritage. There have been a number of exhibitions, publications, fascinating legacy there of a segment of the Jewish community that was, of course, very prominent in that, and essentially now extinct, except for some remnants in Egypt and in Shanghai and so on. So I'd love to hear any thoughts about that. And finally, I've always been curious about Ladino and the extent to which it serves anything like an equivalent function as that played by Yiddish in the Ashkenazi world. Thanks.
Well, I would say, first of all, that the distinction between Sephardic and Mizrahi, it's something I feel very passionate about. One of the things when the mission of Sephardic Heritage International, it says to build intercultural bridges first and to raise awareness of Sephardic and other underrepresented Jewish heritages. And part of the reason we have underrepresented Jewish heritages is because to cover people, the folks who would say that Sephardic and Mizrahi are different things, because those heritage are also underrepresented. I personally, I do not like the term Mizrahi, whereas one of my Hachamim, Hacham Sassoon, who's Iraqi, but is actually part of the Spanish and Portuguese, more aligned with the Spanish and Portuguese movement, said, some people call me Oriental. And in fact, when we had him at the Portuguese embassy, he said that. And I don't like the term. The largest Mizrahi group are Moroccans. Morocco is east of Ireland. So in which way are you Oriental? But at the same time, people have connected to the term. A number of people say, well, it's not our, I have colleagues who say it's not their ethnicity. They say I'm Yemenite, but say I'm Mizrahi as an act of protest. And I said, I can get down with that, you know? It's an act of protest. Because it became a term to refer to anyone who was not from Europe. Although there were 5 different groups in Europe: Sephardic, Italian, Romaniot, Ashkenazi, and Sephardic. So even Europe, the only place in Europe that was throughout history has been exclusively Ashkenazi is northeast. Every other part, all the other groups. So even like we have to even sort of rethink what do we think of when we say European Jewry. And so I do not like the term Mizrahi, but for people who want to use it, power to them. And there's nothing I can do about it, except, you know, argue, tell you my opinion. You know, there's an argument between people whether at first people going from Black to African American, and there are people who didn't, you know, argue about it, but now, come on, tell somebody you don't like to use the term African American. Doesn't mean anything because people identify that way. But I'll tell you something to add to that is a lot of the tradition in Spain came originally from Iraq, or at least within my church. As someone who experiences the tradition, I see it's something that originated from the Geonim in Babylon and came to Spain. And Spain was not an isolated place. Spain was a major center in a world that included North Africa and the Middle East. And that's in fact, that was the intellectual center of the Jews of throughout Europe, or not Ashkenazi, and also North Africa and the Middle East. And so to separate Sephardic from Mizrahi is like cutting off the head and leaving the body. Because there are many more Mizrahim than we identify that way as opposed to Sephardic. And so it actually weakens our communities.
We have time for one more question, and I'm gonna ask the panelists to be really, you wanna pick up the other part of that? We got like 3 minutes.
3 minutes. 2, if you want to be academic and technical, right? Mizrahi just means their point of origin is east, wherever you want east to be. Sephardi, their point of origin is Spain, Portugal. So you have, as Ephraim points out, Mizrahi Jews all over the place, going from Judea, Palestine, east to Iraq, Baghdad further, and west as far as Morocco. When Jews start leaving in 1391, many of them come from Spain and Portugal across North Africa. So now you have a mixture between Mizrahi and Sephardim. The Ashkenazim think they're all alike. They don't know there's a difference anyway. But then the Ashkenazim really means the Rhineland Jews, except they migrate into Eastern Europe and so on. So it's more complex. India, 5 distinct Jewish communities, one of which is associated generally with the Middle East. They call Baghdadi. That's where the Sassoons come from. They go as far as Shanghai. They do very well with trade. They build synagogues. They do the same in Mumbai and elsewhere in India, including for non-Baghdadi Jews like the Bene Israel and like the Kochini Jews. And then there are 2 groups of Jews from India, the Bene Moshe and the Bene Menashe and the Bene Ephraim, that assumed Jewish identities in the 70s and 90s respectively. So it's a very complex geography is what I'm saying. And really, we're saying the same thing from 2 different sides of the fence. Yeah, that's it.
All right, we're gonna wrap it up here. We wanted to thank our panelists again. One of the things that makes Bet Mish so important is our Siddur. Our Siddur talks about the conception of God as both male, female, and non-binary. And it makes sure that there's a place for women and queer people. So this is our gift to you for speaking with us today. Fred doesn't get one. He's a congregant. He didn't get one.
His initial
the initial question, Patrick. Did you figure out which of the three of us?
So which one married me? Probably they're all like, nobody should. Anyway, this is.
Who is dumb enough to marry?